Why seeking approval makes you invisible. The message you kept waiting for. You sent the message, then you waited. You reread what you wrote, checked the tone, wondered if it sounded too eager, too cold, too much, and then nothing. No reply. And in that silence, something shifted inside you. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way things shift when you've been doing this for so long that you no longer notice it's happening. That's not anxiety, that's not overthinking. That's something much older and much deeper. A pattern so woven into the way you move through the world that it stopped feeling like a choice a long time ago. You decide how to feel based on how others respond to you. Not always, not in every situation, but more often than you'd like to admit. In the meeting where you watched someone's face while you were speaking, in the conversation where you softened what you actually meant because you weren't sure how it would land, in the version of yourself you present on a Tuesday morning versus who you are when no one is watching on a Sunday night. This video is not about caring less about people. It's not about becoming cold or detached or building walls around yourself and calling it strength. The Stoics were never about that, and anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't read them carefully enough. This is about something more precise, more uncomfortable, and if you're willing to sit with it, more transformative than most things you've been told about confidence, identity, or self-worth. Here's the real problem. Seeking approval doesn't just make you anxious, it makes you invisible. Not invisible to others, though that happens too, and we'll get to exactly why. Invisible to yourself. Because every time you adjust who you are to be accepted, you move one step further from the person you actually are. And after enough adjustments, enough edits, enough silent negotiations between what you feel and what you show, you look up one day and realize you've been performing for so long that you genuinely don't know what the unperformed version of you looks like anymore. Epictetus wrote in the Enchiridion, chapter 1, that some things are within our power and some things are not. Opinion, he said, is within our power. The opinion others hold of us is not. That distinction, 2,000 years old, is still the most precise diagnosis of the trap most people spend their entire lives inside. But knowing that distinction intellectually changes nothing on its own. The pattern doesn't break because you read a quote. It breaks because you understand, at a level that goes beyond the mind, what it has actually cost you. And that's where we begin. Not with philosophy, not with theory. With a question you've probably never asked yourself directly. What have you given up, quietly, gradually, without anyone forcing you, in exchange for being accepted? That answer is the beginning of everything that follows. The invisible price. Nobody asked for approval out loud. That's the first thing to understand. You don't walk into a room and announce that you need people to validate you before you can relax. It doesn't work like that. It works in the small things, the almost imperceptible things. The way you laugh a little louder when someone important is watching. The way you hold back an opinion not because you're unsure of it, but because you're unsure of how it will be received. The way you dress differently depending on who you're going to see. Not as a social courtesy, but as a quiet negotiation between who you are and who you think they need you to be. This is the invisible price, and it's paid in micro installments every single day. The Stoics had a word for the territory of the self that truly belongs to you, prohairesis. It's the faculty of rational choice, the inner capacity to judge, to decide, to respond. Epictetus in the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 1, describes it as the only thing that is truly free by nature. Not free because someone gave you permission, free because no external force can reach it unless you hand it over yourself. And that's the uncomfortable part. Nobody takes your sense of self from you. You lend it out repeatedly in exchange for something that feels safer in the moment. Acceptance. Think about the last time you changed something about how you expressed yourself. Not to be clearer, not to be kinder, but specifically to avoid discomfort in someone else. Maybe you swallowed a disagreement. Maybe you performed enthusiasm you didn't feel. Maybe you let a moment pass where you could have been honest and chose smooth instead. Small things. Individually, they seem irrelevant. Cumulatively, They are the architecture of a life lived slightly outside yourself. And here's what nobody tells you about that life. It's exhausting in a way that's very hard to name. It's not the exhaustion of working hard or carrying heavy things. It's the exhaustion of constant calibration, of always having one part of your attention focused outward, scanning, adjusting, reading the room, measuring the response. You can't fully rest in a conversation when part of you is permanently monitoring it. That's not connection, that's performance with the lights on. What makes this so difficult to see is that it often looks like virtue, it looks like empathy, like consideration, like being socially aware, and those things are real. The Stoics valued them deeply. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively in the Meditations about the importance of treating others with patience and care. But there is a precise and critical difference between genuine consideration for another person and the anxious monitoring of their reaction to you. One comes from strength, the other comes from fear. And only one of them leaves you intact at the end of the day. The price you pay isn't visible on any single day. It accumulates. And by the time most people notice it, they've been paying it for years. So what exactly are you paying for? And who set the original price? The performance you forgot you started. There's a version of you that existed before you learned to monitor reactions, before you understood that certain expressions of who you were made people uncomfortable or distant or critical, before you figured out, through experience, through trial and error, through moments that probably hurt more than you've fully processed, that being yourself without filtering carried risk. You didn't decide to become a performer. You adapted. And at the time that adaptation was intelligent, it was even necessary. A child who learns to read the emotional temperature of a room and adjust accordingly isn't weak. They're responding to their environment with the tools available to them. The problem isn't that the adaptation happened. The problem is that most people never realize when it stops being necessary. The performance continues long after the original audience has left the stage. This is what psychology describes as a conditioned identity, a self-concept built not from the inside out, but from the outside in. Shaped by feedback, by approval, by the slow accumulation of signals about which version of you was welcome and which wasn't. And because it was built gradually, it feels completely natural. It feels like you, which is exactly what makes it so difficult to question. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 3, paragraph 16, that a man should not value anything that will require him to break his own word or lose his self-respect to obtain it. He wasn't talking about dramatic moral failures. He was talking about the daily erosion, the small surrenders that seem insignificant in isolation, but that over time redefine the boundaries of who you are. Here's the question worth sitting with. When did you last do something, said something, expressed something, chose something that you knew might cost you approval and did it anyway, not out of rebellion, but out of simple fidelity to what was true for you? For some people, that question surfaces a recent memory. For others, it's surprisingly hard to answer, not because they're dishonest, but because the habit of pre-filtering has become so automatic that the unfiltered version rarely gets a chance to form before the editing begins. And this is where the Stoic insight becomes not philosophical, but visceral. Epictetus didn't teach detachment as an intellectual exercise. He taught it as a survival mechanism, because he understood from lived experience what it costs a human being to locate their sense of worth entirely in something outside their own control. He had nothing the world recognized as valuable, no status, no freedom, no approval to earn. And from that position, he saw something most people with comfortable lives never have to confront directly, that the self built on external validation is not a self at all. It's a reflection, and reflections disappear when the light changes. What happens to you when the approval stops? The contradiction nobody admits. Let's be honest about something. The people who say, "I don't care about anyone's opinion," are statistically among the most approval-dependent people in any room. Not always. but often enough that it's worth naming. Because that declaration, delivered with confidence, sometimes with pride, is itself a performance. It's designed to generate a specific reaction: admiration, respect, the perception of strength, which means it is at its core a bid for approval dressed up as indifference. This isn't a judgment, it's a pattern, and it runs deep. The Stoics never claimed that the path to inner freedom was announcing your inner freedom. Epictetus, in the Enchiridion, chapter 13, wrote something far more precise and far less comfortable. He said that if you wish to make progress, you must be willing to appear foolish and ignorant in the eyes of others. Not proudly, not performatively, just willing. There's a significant difference between performing independence and actually practicing it. One is still oriented toward the audience. The other has stopped needing one. Think about the last time you were in a group and held a position that you knew was unpopular. Not a dramatic stand, just a quiet, honest disagreement. What happened in your body? Was there a pull toward softening it? Toward finding common ground faster than was actually true? Toward laughing it off before it became a real point of tension? That pull is real. It's not weakness. It's the nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do: minimize social risk. But here's what that training costs you in the long run: credibility. Your own credibility with yourself. Because every time you feel that pull and follow it, some part of you notices. Not loudly. Just quietly registers the moment where what you said and what you actually thought diverged. And over time, those moments accumulate into something corrosive. A subtle but persistent sense that you can't fully trust yourself to show up as yourself when it matters. That's not low confidence. That's the logical result of a pattern, where your inner experience and your outer expression have been misaligned for long enough that the gap starts to feel normal. And here's the contradiction at the center of all of it. You want to be truly seen. Most people do. The desire for genuine connection, to be known, not just accepted, is one of the deepest human drives there is. But the behavior that approval-seeking produces moves in exactly the opposite direction. It generates a version of you that is optimized for acceptance and therefore impossible to truly know. You become legible but not real, present but not there. Epictetus understood this with a clarity that still cuts. He wrote that no man is free who is not master of himself, not master of his circumstances, not master of how others see him, master of himself. Because the moment your sense of who you are depends on who is watching, you are not free, you are managed. By an audience you didn't choose, performing a role you never consciously agreed to play. The question isn't whether you care what people think. Of course you do. The question is whether that care has become the architecture of your identity, and what it would mean if it stopped being the foundation. That answer lives somewhere in the next part of this. The slave who was freer than you. There is something deeply unsettling about the life of Epictetus, not because it was tragic, though by any external measure it was, but because of what he did with it. He was born into slavery. He had no legal name, no property, no social standing. At some point during his captivity, his leg was broken. Some accounts say deliberately by his owner, as a demonstration of power. And Epictetus, by the accounts that survived, remained calm. Not because he was indifferent to pain, but because he had already located himself somewhere his owner could not reach. Most people read that story and feel a distant admiration, a philosophical respect. What's harder and more important is to ask what that story reveals about you. You have freedoms Epictetus never had. You can leave rooms he couldn't leave. You can speak words he wasn't permitted to speak. You can choose in ways he could not, how to spend your hours and your years. And yet, in the specific territory he was describing, the inner territory, how free are you actually? Because Epictetus wasn't free despite his circumstances. He was free within them. And the mechanism of that freedom was precise. He had completely stopped locating his identity in anything outside his own rational faculty. Not in his body, not in his reputation, not in whether the people around him approved of how he carried himself. He wrote in the Enchiridion that if anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, don't make excuses about what was said. Instead, answer, "He did not know my other faults, or he would not have mentioned only these." Read that again slowly. There is no defensiveness in it, no performance of confidence, no bid for the other person to reconsider. Just a complete absence of the need for the external verdict to match the internal one. That's not arrogance. Arrogance is still oriented toward the audience. It just flips the dynamic, replacing the need to be approved with the need to be seen as above approval. What Epictetus describes is something quieter and rarer, a self that simply doesn't require external confirmation to remain stable. Most people have never experienced that, not because they're incapable of it, but because they've never had to develop it. The modern world offers enough validation, enough feedback, enough social signal, that you can go an entire lifetime keeping your sense of self afloat on external input without ever being forced to ask what's underneath it. But here's what that means in practice. Your identity becomes load-bearing on things that can shift without warning. A relationship ends. A reputation takes a hit. Someone whose opinion mattered stops offering it, and suddenly, the structure that felt solid reveals itself as something far more fragile than you knew. Epictetus lost everything the world considered valuable before he was old enough to choose otherwise. And what that loss produced, paradoxically, brutally, completely, was the only kind of freedom that cannot be taken. Because it was never located anywhere someone else could reach. The question is not whether you admire that. The question is whether you're willing to trace, honestly, how much of your current sense of self depends on inputs you don't control. And what would remain if those inputs disappeared tomorrow? Why, the more you seek, the less they see. Here is the paradox at the center of this entire conversation, and it's one that most people spend years circling, without ever landing on it directly. The more you adjust yourself to be accepted, the less there is to actually connect with. This isn't abstract, you've felt it from the other side. Think about the people in your life who feel genuinely present, the ones whose company leaves you feeling like something real happened. They are almost never the people who are working hardest to be liked. They are the ones who seemed, in some way you couldn't fully articulate, to not need your approval in order to show up fully. And that quality, that groundedness, that lack of anxious calibration, is what made them magnetic. Not their confidence, not their achievements, their consistency, the sense that who they were in the room was actually who they were. Now think about the interactions that felt hollow, the conversations where you left feeling vaguely unsatisfied, like you'd been talking to a version of someone rather than to the person themselves. Chances are that person was working hard, presenting well, saying the right things, but something was slightly off. A subtle misalignment between what was being expressed and what was actually there. You couldn't name it, but you felt it. This is what happens when approval-seeking becomes the operating system. The signal gets distorted. People receive a transmission that's been edited so many times that the original frequency is barely detectable. And human beings, who are extraordinarily sensitive to authenticity even when they can't explain why, respond to that distortion by withholding the very thing the approval seeker is trying to generate. Real connection, real recognition, real presence. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations that a man's worth is no greater than the worth of his ambitions. He was talking about the direction of desire, what you orient your energy toward and why. When the primary ambition becomes being seen a certain way, everything else, your actual thoughts, your actual values, your actual presence, gets subordinated to that aim. And the result is a kind of social invisibility that is particularly cruel because it looks from the outside like engagement. You're in the room, you're participating, you're saying the right things, but you're not there, not fully. Because part of you is always backstage, managing the production. The people who are truly seen are the ones who stopped producing. not because they stopped caring, but because they relocated their attention from the audience's reaction back to their own experience of the moment. That shift is small in theory. In practice, it changes everything about how you occupy space, how you speak, and what other people feel when they're near you. Presence isn't a performance skill. It's what's left when the performance stops. And the performance stops when you no longer need the review, what the emperor chose to ignore. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the Western world for nearly 2 decades. He commanded legions. He decided the fates of nations. He was surrounded constantly by people whose entire professional existence depended on his approval, and who therefore offered him, in return, an uninterrupted stream of admiration, agreement, and flattery. And he spent his private journals, the meditations never intended for publication, written only for himself, repeatedly, almost obsessively, dismantling the value of all of it. That detail matters more than most people realize. These weren't public declarations of philosophical virtue. They were private notes, the kind of writing you do when you're trying to talk yourself into something you keep forgetting. Which means that Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by more approval than any person could realistically need, was still fighting the same pull you feel when you're waiting for a message back. He wrote in the Meditations that it is possible to live well even in a palace. Not comfortable, not easy, possible, because the obstacle wasn't the palace. It was the seduction of what the palace represented. Status, legacy, the gaze of history. The approval not just of the living, but of everyone who would come after. He understood something that takes most people a lifetime to arrive at. Public opinion is not a stable foundation. It shifts with circumstance, with mood, with the political weather. The man praised today is blamed tomorrow, often for the same qualities. Building your sense of self on that surface is not just psychologically unstable. It is, in the Stoic view, a form of voluntary captivity. But here's what makes Marcus Aurelius more than just an interesting historical figure for this conversation. He didn't write about ignoring people. He wrote about loving them, about the obligation to act for the common good, to treat others with patience and genuine care. He held both things simultaneously, deep investment in the well-being of others, and complete non-attachment to their judgment of him. That combination is rare. Most people oscillate between 2 failure modes, either caring so much about others' opinions that they lose themselves, or caring so little that they become indifferent and isolated. Marcus Aurelius points to the narrow path between them. Care fully, need nothing back. That is not emotional unavailability. That is not coldness. It is the specific kind of freedom that allows you to be genuinely generous, because your generosity is no longer secretly a transaction. You're not giving in order to be seen as giving. You're not being patient in order to be appreciated for your patience. You're doing what you do because it aligns with who you are, and that alignment doesn't require an audience to remain intact. The question is how to actually live there, not as a philosophy, as a daily practice, in a world that is specifically designed to pull you in the opposite direction. That's where this goes next. The system that profits from your insecurity. Let's talk about something that rarely gets named in conversations about approval and identity. Because the pattern we've been describing, the monitoring, the adjusting, the invisible negotiation between who you are and who you think you need to be, didn't develop in a vacuum. It developed inside a specific environment, and that environment didn't just tolerate the pattern, it was built to amplify it. Every major platform you use daily is engineered around a single psychological mechanism: the variable reward of social feedback, the like, the comment, the share, the view count, the follower number that goes up or down. These are not neutral features. They are, by design, extensions of the same circuitry that made you reread that message before you sent it. The same circuitry that made you scan someone's face while you were speaking to see if they were still with you. The difference is scale, and the difference is permanence. Before these systems existed, approval-seeking was bounded by physical space. You could only monitor the reactions of the people actually in the room with you. Now the room is infinite, the feedback loop never closes, and the metrics are always visible, not just to you but to everyone else, which means your social standing becomes something that can be publicly measured, compared, and updated in real time. This is not a small thing. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, that the anticipation of judgment is often more damaging than the judgment itself. He wrote that in the 1st century, without a smartphone, without a notification system, designed by engineers whose explicit professional goal was to maximize the time you spend inside it. What Seneca was describing as a philosophical vulnerability, the modern attention economy turned into a business model. And here is what makes this particularly relevant to everything we've been discussing. The system doesn't create the need for approval. It finds a need that already exists, ancient, deeply human, completely understandable, and it monetizes it. It builds an infrastructure around it. It gives you a number that quantifies your social worth and updates it constantly, so that the question, am I acceptable, is never fully answered, and therefore never fully stops being asked. You are not weak for being affected by this. You are a human being operating inside a system specifically calibrated to your psychological vulnerabilities. The Stoics couldn't have anticipated social media, but they understood the underlying mechanism with complete precision, that anything located outside your own rational faculty will be used against you eventually by something or someone who benefits from your instability. The question is not whether the system is powerful. It is. The question is whether you've decided consciously what role you're going to let it play in how you understand your own worth. Because that decision, and it is a decision even when it doesn't feel like one, is entirely within your control. It always was. What does it look like to actually make it? When you stop asking for permission, there is a specific moment, and if you've ever experienced it, you know exactly what it feels like. When you say something true, something unedited, something that you didn't run through the usual filter first. And instead of the anticipated discomfort, something unexpected happens. The room shifts, the conversation deepens. The person across from you leans in rather than pulling back. That moment is not an accident. It's what genuine presence produces, and it's available far more often than most people allow themselves to access it. The Stoic practice that underlies this is not confidence building in the conventional sense. It's not about convincing yourself that you're worthy of approval or that your opinions matter. It's something more fundamental, a gradual reorientation of attention away from the question, how is this landing? And back toward the question, is this true? Epictetus described this as the practice of distinguishing between what is yours and what is not. Your judgments, your values, your choices, yours. The reaction they generate in others, not yours. Not because other people don't matter, but because their internal experience of you is not something you can control, and therefore not something that should govern how you show up. This sounds simple. It is not simple, because the habit of monitoring external reaction is not just psychological, it's physical. It lives in the body, in the slight tension before you speak, in the breath you hold while waiting for a response, in the way your shoulders carry the weight of a conversation that hasn't happened yet. Unlearning it is not an intellectual exercise, it's a practice. Repeated daily in the small moments where the old pattern wants to reassert itself. What does that practice look like concretely? It starts with noticing the gap. The moment between what you actually think and what you're about to say. That fraction of a second where the editing happens. You don't have to eliminate the editing immediately. Just notice it. Notice how often it happens. Notice what it's protecting you from. Notice whether that protection is still necessary, or whether it's a habit borrowed from a version of your life that no longer exists. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations that the first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit, not an untroubled life. That was never the promise. An untroubled spirit inside whatever life you're actually living. And that quality, that internal steadiness, is not something you perform. It's something you build quietly, through the accumulation of moments where you chose fidelity to your own experience over the comfort of external validation. Internal approval is not self-absorption. It is not indifference to others. It is the only form of approval that is genuinely stable, because it doesn't require the right circumstances, the right audience, or the right response to remain intact. It is, in the most literal sense, the only approval you can actually keep. And when you begin to operate from that place, even partially, even imperfectly, something changes in how you occupy the world. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the people around you feel it. Because what they're feeling is the difference between someone who needs something from the interaction and someone who simply is. That difference is everything, and it leads directly to the hardest part of this conversation. The person who disappeared while being loved. There is a specific kind of loss that almost never gets talked about. Not because it's rare, but because it's almost impossible to name while it's happening. It's the loss of yourself inside a relationship where you were by every external measure accepted. Not a relationship where you were criticized or diminished or treated poorly. One where you were wanted, welcomed, where the approval was real and warm and consistent. And yet, somewhere inside that acceptance, gradually, without any single moment you could point to, you started disappearing. You know this feeling. Maybe it was a long relationship, where you slowly stopped expressing the parts of yourself that created friction. Maybe it was a job where the culture was positive and inclusive, and you found yourself, year by year, becoming a more polished version of a person you didn't fully recognize. Maybe it was a friendship, where the dynamic was so comfortable that you never risked saying the thing that might disturb it, and eventually stopped having the things to say that would. This is the cruelest version of the approval trap, because it doesn't announce itself as a trap, it announces itself as belonging. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius that one of the most dangerous things a person can do is to merge so completely with the crowd, or with another person, or with a role, that they lose the thread of their own judgment. He wasn't warning against love or community or commitment. He was warning against the specific dissolution that happens when the need to remain acceptable overrides the commitment to remain honest, with others, and more importantly, with yourself. Here is what that dissolution actually feels like from the inside. It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like maturity, like compromise, like being a good partner, a team player, a reliable presence. The vocabulary of erosion is borrowed entirely from the vocabulary of virtue, which is why it's so extraordinarily difficult to recognize in real time. You tell yourself you've grown, that you've learned to let go of ego, that the sharp edges you've smoothed were things worth losing. And some of that may even be true. But underneath it, if you're honest in the quiet of a moment when no one is asking anything of you, there is sometimes a faint but persistent sense of someone knocking from the inside. That's not a metaphor. That's the part of you that knows the difference between genuine growth and strategic disappearance. The Stoics were not romantics about the self. They didn't believe the self was sacred or permanent or beyond scrutiny. Marcus Aurelius spent years in the Meditations, interrogating his own motives with a rigor that was almost brutal. But that interrogation was always in service of something, of becoming more aligned with reason, with nature, with what was actually true. Not more aligned with what was comfortable, not more aligned with what kept the peace. The question this topic leaves open is the one that leads directly into everything that follows. If you have disappeared, partially, gradually, in the ways that feel too small to name, what does it actually look like to come back? Not loudly, not dramatically, not by burning down what you've built, but back nonetheless. That answer is closer than you think. And it begins with something far simpler than most people expect. Being seen starts here. Let's go back to the beginning. You sent the message. You waited. You reread what you wrote, wondered if the tone was right, wondered if you said too much or not enough. And then you waited for the response, because somewhere along the way you learned to let that response tell you how to feel about yourself. That's where we started, and it's worth returning to it now, not to judge it, but to see it clearly, because clarity is where everything changes. That habit, that loop of send, wait, monitor, adjust, is not a character flaw. It is not evidence that something is broken in you. It is the completely logical result of a long education in a world that taught you consistently, and from an early age, that your value was something other people confirmed. That belonging was something you earned by being the right version of yourself in the right moment for the right audience. You learned that lesson well. Most people do. The Stoics didn't ask you to unlearn it overnight. They didn't offer a technique or a mindset shift or a morning routine that would dissolve 2 decades of conditioning before breakfast. What they offered was something slower and more honest, a direction, a reorientation, a daily practice of returning, gently, without drama, to the only place where your sense of self was ever actually safe. Inside. Epictetus wrote in the Enchiridion that wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. He was talking about material things on the surface, but the principle runs deeper than that. The person who needs constant approval to feel stable is, in the Stoic sense, impoverished, not because they're weak, but because they've located their wealth somewhere that can be withdrawn at any moment by someone who owes them nothing. The return to yourself is not a rejection of others. This needs to be said clearly, because it's the most common misreading of Stoic philosophy on this subject. Caring less about what people think does not mean caring less about people. Marcus Aurelius loved the people around him, wrestled with that love, wrote about it, tried to serve it well. But he understood that love and need are not the same thing. That you can be fully present with someone without requiring their approval to remain intact. That you can give generously without secretly keeping score of whether the giving is being recognized. That combination, full presence, no dependency, is not a philosophical ideal. It is a livable reality. It is, in fact, the only version of connection that doesn't quietly corrode over time. So here is what this actually looks like in practice. Not as a transformation, as a beginning. The next time you feel that pull, to edit yourself before you speak, to monitor a reaction, to decide how you feel based on how someone else responds. Pause. Not to suppress it, not to perform indifference, just to notice it. To name it for what it is. An old habit, built for an old environment, running on autopilot in a present that no longer requires it. And then ask yourself, not rhetorically but genuinely, what would you say if the response didn't matter? What would you do if approval wasn't part of the calculation? Who would you be in this moment if no one was keeping score? That person, the one who answers those questions honestly, is not a better version of you. It is not an idealized version. It is simply the version of you that has always been there, underneath the performance, waiting with remarkable patience for you to stop auditioning and start arriving. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength, not comfort, not ease, strength. The specific kind of strength that comes not from controlling what others think of you, but from no longer needing to. You sent the message. It was enough. You were enough before the reply came. You will be enough if it never does. That's not a consolation. That's the whole point. And it was always true.